without further ado, because we stay on schedule, Felipe is here from Portland by way of France, from what I understand, and he is going to talk to us about breaking into embedded devices, including phones, phones that you might have on your desk at work, phones that might be, I'm not even going to get into that, phones that might be around. Let's learn about embedded device hacking. Let's give Felipe a big round of applause. Have a good time, man.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here. It's like a big honor. And yeah, so today we're going to talk about hardware hacking, and I'm going to share like this introduction to it, and I hope I can share some love about hardware hacking. So who am I? I'm Philippe Lalouette. I'm a senior security researcher at McAfee Advanced Threat Research. So I do software and hardware vulnerability research, and you can find me on Twitter at phlol. Before joining McAfee, I spent 2 years doing embedded security, and before that I was a C++ dev. So I'm more coming from a software background, actually. So you could wonder, like, why should you care about hardware hacking in the first place, right? I can see like two main reasons. First is like it's actually really fun and empowering to be able to break open like a device that you like have in your home, at work, whatever. And instead of considering that it's a black box, you can instead like start poking at it and understanding how it works. And then in a more like pragmatic way, if we consider like security in the past couple of years, software is becoming much harder to like break. Like if you try to like pawn like whatever like embedded device as like a web server, like finding a vuln in a web server by itself is kind of hard. But if instead you can just like open the device, solder a couple of wires, and get like a shell from that, that's much easier. So hardware hacking is great because it's also like a lot of low-hanging fruits basically. So today we're going to talk about Avaya phones, and especially like the phone picture on the right side of the slide is a 9611G model. So Avaya is like one of the biggest VoIP solution provider. You can find them like all over the place. It covers like 90% of the Fortune 100 company, and I think that specific model of phone started in 2006 and is going to be end of life like at the end of the year or something. And funny, on the bottom right of my slide, there is this funny like screenshot from like a firmware download page from like a really old firmware for these phones, where actually like you can see that you can only download that specific firmware if you're like a DoD customer. So basically you can see that these phones are like going to a lot of different places. So regarding prior art in hardware hacking, there's like a lot of information nowadays on the internet. Like you can find a lot of blog posts, tutorials. There's like the hardware hacking village that you all go and check out. CTF as well, where you can like practice like kind of like the software side of stuff. And on my slides are like a bunch of links at the end, so you can like download the slides at later time. And also those slides, I've like the one I've uploaded have like more text on them, so it's like more like standalone. So you can read more. And yeah, Red Balloon Security found like 2 RCs in the same phone, something like 5 years ago or something. And they had like a talk at RSA called Stepping Points that I would also recommend to check out online. So for the next 40 minutes, so I'm going to talk about hardware hacking and use that phone as a base to like support that conversation. And basically the idea of like the whole situation is like a couple of like 12 years ago maybe, Avaya forked some open source code, and they never applied security patches to that. And it turns out that like me, by poking at the device, I found that, and it was like remained like unnoticed for like 10 years, that there were like actually like a CVE that got released like 10 years ago for Defcon. So I'm going to talk about how I found that, like that there was like some stupid like vulnerable code inside the firmware. But more interesting, I think, is talking about the whole process, like how I did it, and why I did what I did it, why I did stuff I did when I did it. Like basically like sharing the process, so that, and also like sharing, what if the stuff I tried didn't work, or also like share like stuff that didn't work, because what works for one device might not work for another, and having just like that mental model of what you can do and what you cannot helps you a lot approaching like any kind of device. And that's, I really think, why I want people to take away from that talk is more like learning the process, so that you can check out like whatever device you have. And yeah, I would want to like insist that if I can do it, I think everyone in this room can do it as well. As I said, I'm more from like software background, and the hardware hacking is still like little scary, little foreign to me. But it's in the end, it's really not that hard if you have like a good process and work with patience. So how did the whole project start? To be honest, I was working at work, and there were all these cubicles, and on every desk I see this phone standing on the desk. I'm like, wait a minute, these phones run Linux, they have network access, they have mics and stuff. It's like, how secure is that? You wonder what's up with it? Did people consider the security of those? So the first step, before even I start stealing my coworker's phone and breaking it apart, you can and that's the general step is you can check out the FCC website. Usually any device that has Wi-Fi or Bluetooth has to be on the FCC website for compliance reason. So that's what I found. That's not my phone. That's a other model of same brand basically, and really close. So you see all these cool pictures, but more interesting is the inside of the phone. So we can enhance it, and on the left side in red, I've highlighted this random debug connector. I don't know what it is, but that's interesting to see that's there. And on the right side, there is that in purple, there is that flash memory. So that's usually where the file system of the phone is going to be stored. And the whole point of that is just to get an idea of what to expect, before even approaching a real target, burying hardware and stuff, so that you know if it's going to be an easy target or a hard target. If everything was covered in black epoxy, that would be harder. So another important step is getting online material, marketing brochure, so you have an idea of what are the phone capabilities and the ecosystem surrounding it, so that you have an idea of the attack surface. And you can also find user manuals and stuff. And for instance, I found that one that was pretty cool. It's a user or advanced user manual that says, oh, if you want a serial connection to the phone, you need that funky box. And which is interesting. It tells us that you can find a serial connection, and you may have some special hardware for that, but we're going to see that in a bit. And after that, you also want to check forums, and so that you can find what power users are doing. For instance, I found the default password for the phone debug interface, because system admin talking about that online. And if you're lucky, you can also download the firmware, have an idea of what's up there, and I will cover that in a minute. Okay, so what do we do now? Now we have an idea of what it might look inside. This is a hardware hacking talk, so we're going to avoid warranties, and so the point is you open the phone first. And the trick is usually you always expect to find the same stuff inside, and if you look at the labels of the components, you will see, and you Google that, you will find out what it is. So for instance, that's my phone, and you can see in the center the CPU, above it the RAM, in a lavender-ish color, some unpopulated header that I marked with a question mark. I think the same header as the one we were seeing in the picture before, and it might be JTAG. I did not have to use it, so I don't know actually. In purple, we have the EEPROM, so that's would hold some settings and stuff. In dark blue, in the bottom of the slide is a kid, RG45. So I was kind of confused when I was looking at that, and I didn't know even the term for it. And the idea is just a regular RG45 Ethernet plug, but with a weird connector, so that you cannot plug the wrong stuff into it. And more interesting in yellow, the UART. So UART is kind of the serial console, and we have this exposed pads. And so usually in manufacturing or something, you would have pogo pins that would directly connect to the pads. And that one is actually really interesting, because you would find you would expect to find a serial console on that. And on the back, we can see the same NAND flash that we've seen in the previous picture. And from that is where the file system would be stored on the device. So, okay, you have, we looked at the stuff inside, and the other thing that's interesting to look at is test points and debug headers. So, and basically all this kind of stuff that are not components. And you can ask, why would you expect to find them inside? And a couple of reasons. One is just, usually the dev board that the guys are going to use is the same as the production board, and maybe they're just not going to solder the debug components. It's the same as if you had software and it was built with debug symbols, for instance. And also part of the manufacturing process, this test points and stuff might be used for flashing the device or making sure that it's flashed properly. And sometimes something died on in the real world, and they want to do a postmortem to understand what happened, and that's useful as well. So what kind of stuff you want to look for in that situation? You want to look at UART that we like looking at before, JTAG that I'm going to cover in a minute, and then like you can also have like random test points that are chilling there like all over the table, all over the board, and there might be like lone test points that say like label like TP1, TP2, whatever. And sometimes that might be like not interesting to you, but sometimes you can find interesting stuff like. You might find that like, oh, if you short like TP64 with ground, it's going to reset the device, which might be actually useful in some extent. So looking at UART, so as I said, it's for like serial connection. And comes in like 3 or 4 pins. The 3 pins would be ground, transmit, and receive. And the 4th pin would be like VCC, so 3 volt, 5 volt, whatever. And usually you don't care about that one. You don't even want to plug it. You don't have to. And might, yeah. And the trick to know is the serial console sends data at different speed, and there are only like a couple of, it's called like baud rate, and there's only like a few common baud rate values. So if you try to plug your system into the UART and you just see gibberish on screen, probably the reason is you just have the baud rate wrong, and you could just like try to cycle through like all the possible one, and you would find something eventually, I think. JTAG is another one that's interesting. So that's for like hardware debugging, and with that you could like debug the CPU usually and execute like instruction by instruction and whatnot. And they come in many different shapes, number of pins and whatnot. So some example like on the bottom of the slide. But actually only a couple of wires are interesting, and at the end of the slides I like link to like a SendMeO article about like understanding JTAG better. But basically, like if you look on the top right side of my slides, there is like a dev board, and there's like a nice JTAG connector like plugged there. And on the other hand, like on the bottom right, it's like some random device I was looking at, which you can see there should be a JTAG, but it's never been soldered on, and so I had to solder directly onto that stuff. And the trick to remember here, if you kind of like solder your own connector, is you actually may have to add like extra resistors called like pull up and pull down resistors that connects like one pin to ground or one pin to like VCC. And the point of that is, actually I don't know the point of that, but the reason is like if you don't have them, it might not work well, or it's work most of the time, it's going to be glitchy. So and if you follow the instruction from like, for instance, like our ARM as specification for like what resistor you need, so you might skip them, but then you might waste time like understanding why it's weirdly like fucked up sometimes. So I would recommend like remember the pull up and pull down resistors. So that's just a random board that my coworker was looking at, just to show you that what I said is actually fairly generic. On the left side we have like UART. On the right side there are like some JTAG connectors. Up there is the upright, there is like the main CPU, whatever, that's under like a shield, and usually you do that for preventing interferences, so it's like a Wi-Fi module, so that's why. And the cool thing to know is usually the shield is grounded, so like if you're looking for the ground on your thing, like either the shield on that kind of stuff or like the casing around the Ethernet port or whatever is also actually like fairly useful. So now that we learn how to look into stuff, we need to know what hardware you need for interfacing with what's inside. So I'm going to present like a bunch of cool hacking toolset that's important. So the first one, you may want this pin or like the stickers. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but actually like what's really important is like safety. So don't work with stuff that's plugged in the wall. Remember to unplug stuff. Work in like well-ventilated room. It's important. And yeah, just don't be stupid when you're like messing with hardware. But yeah. So next picture from the lab. I'm holding soldering irons. You can usually switch tip for like if you have a large tip for like big soldering and tiny ones for small soldering. I have a microscope, so that's really useful for doing tiny soldering. And the trick is I tend to drink a lot of coffee and I shake, so I was thinking like I couldn't do that. But actually if you're careful, and the trick is like really like try to when you're soldering, like try to hold your arm like straight and well grounded. And under the microscope you can actually do a lot of stuff that's you shouldn't think you wouldn't be able to you would think you shouldn't be able to do it, but you actually can. Sorry. Top right side, it's what I actually use for doing tiny soldering, and it's like top right is like flux, so it's kind of magic gooey substance that you put on pins to when you're soldering surface mount or pads, so that it works really well. So never forget flux. Bottom is like in the same size like copper wires, like enamel wire that you use usually for making coils, for like radio or whatever. And the trick is like the wire is actually coated in varnish, so it doesn't short. And you can use that to do like really tiny point-to-point like soldering, and that's actually really useful. And just next to it, you have like some desoldering wick. So like the idea is if you put too much solder and you fuck it up, you can put the wick on top of the solder blob that you messed up with, and you put the soldering iron on top of that. It's going to get really hot, so you want to hold it through like the plastic casing, and it's going to absorb all the like extra solder, and you can clean up your stuff. And then I put like a picture of like some random like jumper wires that are usually always useful to have. And on the bottom right, I have like that crazy heat gun, which is like $60 at Home Depot. It's meant to like help paint dry or something, I'm not sure, but it's actually really useful for if you're on the chip, if you want to remove components by just like hitting them and pulling them off. So more cool hardware, that's a multimeter. If you're not familiar with that, you use it for finding voltage of chip. You don't know like what's the actual voltage, so the black goes to ground, and with the red, with the right probe, you start like poking around to measure the voltage. And the other really cool stuff is you can set it in continuity mode, and when you have like connection between the two probes, it beeps. So if you do like crappy soldering job, as I was describing just before, you can make sure that you actually did a proper job where like everything is connected the way you think by making sure that both like when you probe like both sides, it actually beeps. And that's actually a fairly useful tool. The other one is, this is a logic analyzer. The name is like a Sally, that's a brand. And the idea is the same as in software, you have like ways of communicating between process. Like in hardware, you have like ways of communicating between chips or the CPU and the chip. And it's like a lot of different standards, different ways of doing stuff. But the logic analyzer like know a lot of them, and is going to convert like a bunch of signals that's going onto wires into actual data. And that's actually really useful. That would be your eyes, like when you're doing debugging, And that's like a snapshot of like some SPI communication, which SPI is just some random protocol. That's like an FTDI cable, also come in many, or serial cable. It comes in many different shapes and stuff. And the idea is just like when you want to do like UART, you plug that into your laptop and you connect the other side to like the UART port, and you get like a console. It shows up at the serial port. And as an example, I have on the bottom right, like a Raspberry Pi. You can actually get a serial console, and you don't need like HDMI cable or anything to interface with that. The Bus Pirate, other like cool device. It does. It's kind of dependent of the hardware hacking. The Sally, the logic analyzer. So instead of absorbing data, it's like send data, so it speaks a bunch of different protocol, and you can use Python to program it. So it's extremely useful if you want to like read Flash, program microcontrollers, and that kind of stuff. More cool stuff like I was talking about JTAG. That's the JTAG debuggers that's why you would plug actually like the JTAG port on. They come in many different like price range and whatnot. So on the bottom right is a fly swatter. It's like for like $30, I think, and it works okay. And above it's like a J-Link, which is more fancy. And the idea is like the more expensive the stuff is, probably the more reliable it is, and it comes with like better software and whatnot. And on the bottom right, the pink board is a JTAGulator that Joe Grant, the same guy who made like those badges, made, and it's really awesome. So if you have like that board, you don't know what it is, and there's like a bunch of test points, and you're like, I bet there is some JTAG somewhere in it, but you don't know where. You can just wire like all the test points to the JTAGulator, and it's going to brute force like and try to find everything. So it's really cool. Another important tool is Flash readers. So usually Flash the Flash has the file system and stuff, and so you want to like interface with that. And it comes in two flavors, I guess. You can do like in-circuit stuff. So you have like either like a little like clamp that you put on the chip, or like the little rectangular one, it's a clip-on. So like the Raspberry Pi is a good one for that, and on the top right is like a flash cat, just like useful for the rectangular one. But you can also like choose to like actually desolder the chip, and in that case you would have like some like socket adapter, so you can clip the chip on and then you plug it into your flash card or whatever, and it's going to read it. And I will cover like why it's important like both in a minute. And finally, it's kind of the last hope. So let's say your flash is encrypted, there is no UART, there is no firmware. So you can try to do like the more crazy stuff like fault injection and side channel attack. So that's a chip whisperer, so like more like a kind of hard, more badass device. And the idea with that is you can do stuff like you wire it and to the CPU, and you're going to drop the power on the CPU for like a split second, and it's going to like mess up some instruction, and you can bypass checks and stuff. That's what people use for like gaming console hacking and that kind of stuff. So what do we do now? That we have an idea of what's inside the phone and the tools we can use. So there's like, I think there's 3 potential track. One is messing with the UART, so the serial console. Another one is messing with the flash and trying to recover the firmware or something, and then maybe you can just download the firmware online. And the 3 are like valid approach, and sometimes it's good to just go from one to another, and whenever you find like some hurdle, you can like go from one to another. So I went for the UART first, and that's what I'm greeted at by when I connect my FTDI cable to the UART port that I was showing before. So we can see like on the left side the console thing. It's like ... Usually when you see that, you can press space or escape, and it's going to interrupt the booting process of the phone. And in that situation, but somehow here it didn't work, and I will cover that why in a minute. And on the top right side of the slide, we can see like it read something from the EEPROM, and it decided to set the console to dev null. So you don't want console to be dev null because that goes nowhere, but that's interesting to know that there is some potential there. And finally, it says like booting Linux, so it confirms that it's a Linux board, but then there is nothing more after that. So that's some good thing, bad things. So the problems are like nothing shows up after like the Linux is as booted, probably because of the dev null situation. And when I press key, it's not working, and I'm going to like come up with like why that happened. So at that point I was stuck. I was like, okay, I cannot go anywhere, so I'm going to try to recover the firmware to try to understand what's up with that. Multiple ways of recovering firmwares. It's like an easy way, like you can download it online, and actually that worked. There is like some cool snapshot of that. Sometimes it's encrypted. On our case, it wasn't. But yeah, so you can also try to sniff a firmware update. That's really useful for IoT devices in general, and you can use the network tab, which is like the thing pictured on the top right of the slide. Or you can mirror your port on your switch or whatever. The problem with all of that is oftentimes the firmware update is going to do over like HTTPS, or it might be, and in this case you're like stuck. And then you want to go for like a more like hardware hacking stuff, or like you're going to dump a flash, for instance. And there's like even more advanced technique that I will briefly like talk about. So how do you dump a flash? There is 2 ways, as I was mentioning just before. You can do in-circuit programming and out of circuit. So in-circuit is cool because you don't have to, like remove stuff, break stuff. But there are a couple of issues with that. The main idea is to read the flash, you need to power the flash. And if it's like still plugged into the whole system, when you're like Raspberry Pi, for instance, going to try to read the flash, it's going to try to power like everything else that's connected to the same like bus line, power line. And either your Raspberry Pi is not strong enough to power like a VoIP phone, which you would expect, and in that case, but it's just not going to work. Or maybe your Raspberry Pi is really strong and it's going to do it, but then the problem is the CPU start booting and it's going to talk with the flash, and that's going also to mess up your stuff. So in that situation, you have like 2 choices usually. Either you can try to like lift up the pin, the power pin, so that it doesn't happen, or you can kind of go a little more like YOLO approach, where you want to keep the CPU in reset. So I've been successful with that many times, where I just like start like trying to ground like random test points of stuff on the board, praying that it's not going to fry anything. And usually at some points, like I'm going to notice that, okay, when I do that, the phone like light up but doesn't boot. That's good. And maybe better ways, you can desolder the chip with like the big like heat gun and whatnot. You have to be careful though, because if you like pull it too hard, you might like bend pins, and that's going to be like useless. But a good trick to know is like you can make a little like tinfoil hat or whatever like around the chip, so that like when you're heating up the chip, like the stuff around it doesn't like get too hot, so you don't accidentally like knock off like some like tiny like components that would be like a pain in the butt to put back. And bottom right is like I thought I would have to do that on the phone, so I wanted to practice first, and I just took like some random USB thumb drive and I tried. And actually that worked really nice. But the trick is to remember like also put some flux because it helps. And yeah, just don't be careful with when you pull it off. A few other tricks that actually didn't work on this one, but are good to know. U-boot is the most common bootloader, not used here, but you would find that on pretty much every other device. And the idea is you can also interrupt the boot process of that and ask nicely U-boot, hey, can you load the flash in memory? And then U-boot is also able to dump in a hex, like in the screen, the memory. So this way you can just like write a little script to do that and recover everything from the flash, which is really cool. But usually like dev don't like letting you do that, so they lock that approach, so you cannot like press space to interrupt the boot process. But there is a trick that I also call like the YOLO approach, where instead, when the idea is like U-boot is going to load from the flash, like the Linux kernel or something. But if while it's happening, you start like poking with, like a wire that's connecting to ground, or you start like poking the NAND flash, like some of the pins, it's going to mess up like what U-boot is reading. And after a couple of tries, U-boot is going to be like, damn, that kernel is fucked up. I don't know what to do. And it's going to give you like a shell. So that's really cool. But yeah, as I said, that one wouldn't work on our phone, unfortunately. But just some cool example that I found online where like some guy actually did that. And I underline in like purple on the bottom like the command you need to use to like load the flash in memory. And on the right side, this like little block of text is how U-boot is panicking and be like, I don't know how to do with your kernel, and give you the shell. So so a few more like tricks for dumping a flash. So you can use JTAG. So usually you have, if JTAG works, you're going to be able to dump the RAM. So in this case, that wouldn't be really like dumping the flash, that would be more dumping the firmware. But in a lot of devices, it's going to load the whole stuff in memory. So if you can dump the memory, you're the same. You're pretty good there. And kind of the last hope, but that's one of my favorite about hardware hacking, is you can do crazy stuff. And an example is Scanlime, that person on the internet who she had a Wacom tablet that she wanted to dump the firmware off, and there was like no attack surface at all. But she realized that like when it was like USB stuff, so when you plug your USB onto the laptop, there is some USB exchange that I don't know anything of, but it sends like USB descriptor, and if you glitch the CPU just at that time, it's going to like miss like a boundary check, and it's going to send way more data. And with that, she was able to recover like the full flash, full memory or something. So it's really impressive. And that's what's kind of awesome about hardware hacking. Okay, so we recovered the firmware, in my case, just by downloading online. But what do we do now? We want to analyze it. The best tool for that is called binwalk, and it's just basically a magic dictionary that's going to like look at your binary blob of stuff and be like, halfway through it looks like there is a zip file. I'm going to try to extract it. It tries. Maybe it works. Maybe it doesn't, depending if it was actually a zip file or not. And it does that for everything. And it might also find like compressed file system, such as like SquashFS, GFFS2, etc. And sometimes like your firmware file might just start with like health headers or just like random like ARM code that you could like look at. So I run binwalk on, so that's the firmware file I've downloaded from the website. And once again, it's easy mode. It's just a tar file, and they already like split it up into boot 1, boot 2, and GFFS2. So like binwalk has nothing to do here really, and I can just extract the whole file system. And that's cool because from there I can look at what's on the phone just like that. But the more interesting use case for binwalk is I took like a different firmware file for like another Avaya phone, and this one is way more interesting because binwalk find like a lot of stuff, and I've highlighted like you find the file system and is able to extract it. And there's also that random like MySQL stuff, which I think is a false positive. Then you need to be aware that there will be a lot of false positives, so don't blindly trust what binwalk says. And really, really funny stuff that I was looking at. If you run strings on that specific image, you will find like U-boot strings. So that phone is using U-boot, and the cool stuff I was describing before would actually work on that one. Look. So now that you have extracted the firmware file, what do you want to look for? One of the most interesting stuff is finding the update mechanism. So assuming you have encrypted firmware, like if you reverse engineer that, you might find the keys and how to extract like subsequent firmware updates without having to do like any hardware stuff. And then you want to look for like secrets like passwords, certificates, and so on and so forth. Originally, my goal was to look at the main binary, so that's the thing that deals with like the VoIP stack. That would make sense to look at that. And also you want to look at the bootloader because it may have like hidden commands, explain why our console is not working, that kind of stuff. So remember, the point of all of that was I wanted to get a shell on the device, and what's the process to do that? So the one I want to go for is I want to fix the serial console, like the dev null was not cool. But other approach would be like messing with U-boot arguments. Not working here, obviously. But you can specify the console you want, and the init script can be marked as like, oh, I want bin bash as my init script, and then you have a console. And like kind of last resort stuff that I was considering as well is you could patch the firmware. In our case, the firmware is signed, so that won't work unless you try to glitch it, which is really hard. But you can also try to patch the file system. So the way binwalk extract the GFFS2 stuff, you could modify it and then like repack it and flash it directly onto the flash. And that's usually like a foolproof method, like that would work in most cases. So instead, I'm going to reverse the bootloader. And for that, because I wanted to understand like why DevNull, the console was set to DevNull and stuff, I'm not going to cover ARM in much detail, and I would recommend you to check out Azariah Labs tutorials that cover everything. But just useful here, there is this notion in ARM of literal pool, which is inside the code section, you would find some little chunk of data, and that's usually like used to load in registries, absolute addresses, immediate values, magic offset, that kind of stuff. And FYI, like in case of function calls, the arguments are going to R0 to R3. The return value is in R0, and when you like want to return from your call, it's the return address is saved in like the LR register. That stands for like link register. And the big problem here is we're like trying to load the bootloader, so it's not really ELF. So if you try to import it in IDA doesn't know what to do with it, and so you need to find the loading address for that stuff so it matches where the phone is loading it. Couple of tricks. Sometimes you're lucky and it's going to be printed on screen. That's our case, sweet. But otherwise, you want to look at like headers in the bootloader file, or maybe reset vectors. So that's stuff where like specifically for ARM, like the CPU needs to know specific addresses where like there's like a reset, there's like an interrupt happening, and it's like fairly like square, like that how that's being set up. So if you find that and you find like what looks like an interrupt vector handler or something, you can find like, oh, that must be the address. And finally, the literal pool I was mentioning, really useful because it's going to contain like absolute addresses or point to strings and stuff. So if like you have strings and they look like all fucked up, you probably got the wrong address. And Quark's Lab wrote a blog post about it, so I would recommend you checking it out. So as I said, in our case, it was easy. When it boots, it prints the jump, whatever, and that's actually why you should load it. And on the bottom right side, it's like a bunch of strings. So it's a bunch of addresses that point to strings. That's a snapshot from IDA. And we can see that it's all the strings like prints well, so that means that it's loaded properly. It's not like all messed up. Okay, so now that we have the bootloader and we can like work it with IDA, we want to search for strings. We were looking at, like that sentence, like EEPROM read successful, whatever. So we can use like cross-reference in IDA to find where that string is coming from and look at the function that handles that. And yeah, just as a FYI about like EEPROM and SPI. So the EEPROM that's on the board is called a SPI EEPROM, and SPI is just one of those protocols I was mentioning before. EEPROM is just like a small memory, whatever. And the SPI protocol is just like 4 wires. And the ID, the CPU is sending command, and the EEPROM like reply. And that's a dump from like using the logic analyzer to have a look at what it would look like in real life. That's the data sheet of the EEPROM that you can find online if you Google the label on it. The cool thing is in bottom left of the slide, it tells you like the pinout, so you know how to connect stuff to it. And on the right side of the slide, it tells you which opcodes are for like the SPI command you would send. Like for instance, if you send 3, it's going to be a read. If you send 2, it's going to be a write. So that's something useful to know, right? Oops, sorry. Back to the IDA and the bootloader, we can see the strings we were like looking for, and something extremely promising is we can see the console set to DevNull, but above that there's like two other options, and it's actually saying like, oh, setting console to like UART 0 or UART 1. So we want these ones to be printed. That's a function that actually does print that string. And what it does is roughly clear some bytes on the stack and then read from EEPROM from a magic address, and it's going to compare like bytes that has just been read. And if we have the good value, it's going to actually print on the console, setting the console for DFTTY AM0. So we want that to happen. And something you can ask me is like, well, how did you find that read EEPROM function, And there are like multiple ways of doing that. The easy way that I've highlighted in green in that screenshot is on the bottom right, we can see some like logging that says, oh, EEPROM read fails. So I know that function is responsible for reading EEPROM. But maybe the firmware you're going to look at is not as verbose. In which case, as I said before, like, to read from an EEPROM, you have to send 3 over SPI. So if you find like the SPI function and you see like sending 3, you know what it is. And that's what I've highlighted in yellow. But then like, how do you find the SPI function? It's kind of a problem. 2 ways for that. In my case, once again, it was logged, so it was easy. But usually, like the main trick is you have this something called mapped I/O, a memory mapped I/O. It's this kind of like magic address values in the CPU that, like, if you write to them, it's actually going to send data over like UART or SPI or whatever. If you're lucky, you're going to have a data sheet for the CPU, and it specifies exactly what are those addresses. If you're unlucky, you have to guess, and that's really hard. And at that time, maybe you should like look for something else, or just, you know, you're going to spend a lot of time on that. So we want to patch the EEPROM now, so we can enable the console. Our plan of action is we know the read-write commands. We want to interface with the flash. So to do that, sorry, the EEPROM, we need like a SPI device, and we've seen before the bus pirate is a perfect candidate for that. And we need to connect to the chip. Unfortunately, like it's a really tiny one, and so like the clip I was showing are like too big for that. You can buy online some rigs that people make. It's like expensive and it takes like 5 weeks to get them. So instead, I went kind of crazy and I tried to solder like little wires onto the thing, and I was like, honestly, that's never going to work. But it happened to actually work, and I was like, sweet. And it's all like look like cross because it's like all the flux that remains on that. And that's the code for the bus pirate. It's super like boilerplate thing. And when you just write these magic values that, sorry, I was asked to like replace them with like emojis. But the idea is like, just after that, you're greeted with console is set to like UART 0. And now we have a lot of more stuff printed on console, which is great. But unfortunately, I get like this hurdle, like the input are still like not working. I was like trying to press space or type like, it's like asking for, oh, you want to look at root? I type, nothing happens. Like, oh, what happened? Did I just cut the tray so you cannot send data? We have the board, so we can look at it. So that's just like a zoom up on the thing. And at that time, I was like, you know, looking at the UART pad and start like with my multimeter, like trying to beep out like where it goes. You know, it's following the continuity testing, and eventually it reached some vias like on the right side, and vias are that little hole that connect one side of the board to the other. So the trick is the actual like trace that connects the UART to whatever goes to the other side of the board and goes back and forth, and it's like really like tedious. And eventually I kind of lost where it was going, but it was kind of under that mod port that's like the keyed RG45. And so remember like the recon side, recon part, we have that box, and it's like, oh damn, that's the thing. So I kind of went to like my YOLO approach again, where I was holding like, I had a plug like a jumper cable in my, the transmit of my FTDI cable. And so I had like this like wire that I could poke around. And on the other side, I was like pressing keys on the console, trying to see if something happened. And meanwhile, I was poking like to the pins one by one. And I think at the second one, it actually worked. And I got greeted by like a wood shell on the device. So that was cool. But the trick was on the right side, I have like a proper setup where I plugged my Ethernet cable into the plug. So at that time, I didn't know where the keyed RG45 was. So I just like sanded the plastic of the Ethernet cable so I could like shove it in. And yeah, it just works. So that was nice. Now that we have a wood shell, there's like a lot of debug strings printed on screen, and that's annoying. So the trick, I was like, I want to kill the process that's like flooding my console. There's a watchdog that's going to reboot the device if that happens. So I highlighted in the corner like the magic commands that you can run to kill that. It's just like random Linux stuff. So now we can finally do some vuln research. And really what you're going to do is like look at process running, poke around, look at open ports. There's just a bunch of processes. You see cool stuff, but that's when it started getting interesting. I think at some point I was tired of looking in IDA, and I was like, I'm going to poke more. And I looked at DH client and like, huh. And the really funny part is like, I run DH client and I see this like 2007 copyright. I was like, whoa, that's not a good thing. And if you just run DH client by itself, it's seg faults. I was like, that's weird. And if you like run it the right way, they print a debug message that say, oh, we modified it to work it better on our device. And I'm like, huh, that's interesting. So if we look back and we look for the specific version, it turns out that 10 years ago, actually for Defcon, John Oberheide released like an exploit for that specific version of DH client. So I was like, whoa, that's easy. But we want to make sure that's actually still vulnerable. So the vuln was like a dumb like Stack Overflow, like while handling DHCP options. So we can compare the original source code with the patch source code because DH client is open source. And just to keep in mind, there might be like mitigation, like stack cookies, ASLR, or whatnot. So if we look at the vulnerable code on the left side, we can see a memcopy like highlighted in red that's using like data.len as a field, while on the patch versions I replace that by 4. So the idea is like this bug is subnet, it's a bug in the subnet mask handling, and the subnet mask should be like 4 bytes. But the way the HTTP option works is that you can send up to like 255 bytes, I think, and it used to just dumbly trust whatever you're sending, which is bad. And if we look in IDA at like the actual like function, we can see there is no stack canary, and on the right side, it's not using that magic 4, so it's obviously like still vulnerable. So it's time to exploit stuff. Working on the phone was tedious. I was like, I'm going to try to set up QEMU. If you're not familiar with QEMU, it can do like emulation of ARM stuff or like many other system, and can do either like userland or full system. Userland wouldn't work here because DHCP is going to try to modify an IP and stuff, and that's not cool. But instead, we can do a full system emulation, and those tutorials tell you how to like set up a cool image for that. And we just want to set up the network properly because we want to interfere with DHCP, and naturally, the QEMU stack would give you a DHCP for yourself, so you have to stay like, don't do that. And yeah. So I ran it in QEMU, and after like all this effort, and it's still seg fault. I was like, huh. So it turns out that like Avaya modified stuff that's actually causing the seg fault. And I'm not going to cover that too fast because I'm running like a little out of time. But basically, it's creating that weird socket. It's like a named socket, and so that like the main application, the VoIP stack, can talk with the edge client and share options. The idea is like that's like the main application, and we can see what it does. That's not super interesting. But basically, on the left side, it's like sending data to configure the edge client at startup. And on the right side, I re-implemented that in Python. And you can run that with like socat. So socat is just a kind of like netcat in more like more tools, so you can create that name socket. And the idea, you run the Python script on the host, you run socat on the QEMU like binary image, and that would just work. So now we can start debugging the edge client. We can run GDB. We can try to like actually run the POC. I couldn't compile the original proof of concept. It was like using really old tools, and it's just after like a couple of hours, like, oh fuck that, I'm tired. So instead, I use a Scapy-based exploit. Scapy is a Python library that lets you like mess with network packets like at a fairly low level. And so now we want to like reach the vulnerable code. So I was explaining the bug is in the subnet mask option, and the way DHCP works is like a tag length value like type of stuff. So you say, oh, this option is a subnet mask. Here's the length, here's the value. And obviously it was like, it should be 4, but if you send more, it's fine, but for the DHCP specs. And so we can use Scapy for doing that. So that's like a chunk of my Scapy script, and just the payload in purple is interesting. Basically just sending the subnet mask option with data that would be like A, B, 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 C, 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 and so on and so forth, so that when it crashes in GDB, we can see like all the register we control, and we know exactly if we want to affect which register, which chunk of the shellcode we need to change. And we can see that we're actually controlling PC, so the program counter, so that's good. We know that we have, we have control for execution. And there are like a few more details that I'm going to skip over, but we need to craft a shellcode now. Unfortunately, like it looks like the stack is, you cannot execute the stack, so we would have to wrap it, and that's tedious. But cool stuff is like if you look for, there is like a system call in that binary that I think also Avaya added, and we do control R4. So if we can put a string in memory in an address we know that could be a valid like system command, and put the address in R4, we're good. So if you think about it, DH client, receive configuration values from the server. So probably there is going to be stuff that are stored somewhere, and it turns out that ASLR is disabled. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. But then the idea is like I start like sending like AAAs as like a bunch of options and look at memory to see if I could find that string somewhere. And eventually the domain option was a good one. And so now I can show you a cool demo that's what happened when you actually run the whole stuff. So on the left side we have the phone that's booting. Can I do it? The phone is booting, and the window, the terminal window is like on the left side is a ROG DHCP client running our payload, and on the right side is it's a web server that will provide like a post-exploitation kind of stuff. So we can see the packet is running. To make sure it works, I was catting dev random on the screen, so that's why it looks like a noise. it's fetching data from the web server, and I don't know if you can see, but it's loading like steve.data. FYI, like Steve is actually my boss. That's him. And just then, I'm still like I don't know if there's sound, but I'm exfiltrating audio from the main speaker, and you can see it in VLC that when I'm speaking and clapping my hands, it's actually like reading the audio on the attacker laptop. So that's pretty scary because you can turn your phone into listening device. Thank you. So yeah, and just FYI, like all the tools I use are like actually already on the phone. Like you have like Netcat, you have like stuff to like dump the audio to like STD in. So it's just like writing some shell script, like bash script, whatever. So as a conclusion, for mitigation, like you want to make sure you monitor your network so that you don't have like punks like sending like weird DHCP packets. And actually like McAfee firewall, I can detect that. FYI, you want to segregate your network. To make sure that, for instance, the coffee pot is not able to like send weird DHCP packets to your phone, and make sure IT actually patch your phone because it's the patch got released like Avaya released the patch like a month ago, so make sure it's actually patched. And if you want to think about why this kind of bug happened, like technical debt is really hard to handle, and probably like someone had like in good faith, someone in good faith forked the stuff and they forget about it. So and just as a real quick. Embedded systems are not black boxes, so I would just encourage everyone to look at them, and you can do it now as well. So if you have questions, ask me on Twitter or whatever, and thank you for your time, guys.